On a cold January morning in Rawlins, Wyoming, Jack Mercer wakes up before dawn as he always does. At 67, the former military intelligence sergeant maintains the discipline he learned decades ago in Vietnam. His small, tidy house sits at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by plains that stretch to the distant mountains. The biting wind of this time of year cuts through any clothing, and old snow still covers the shaded corners of the front yard where Margaret, his late wife, used to plant tulips. Jack makes coffee in the old aluminum percolator, pulls his thick flannel jacket on over his wool sweater, and walks to the mailbox at the edge of the road. It's a sacred ritual. Every day the same walk, the same work boots crunching on the packed snow, the same path trodden so many times it has formed a permanent trail in the frozen lawn. But this morning, something is completely different. Inside the mailbox is a brown envelope with no postage stamp, no return address. Just his name, written in precise, impersonal block letters. Jack feels an immediate tightness in his chest. No one delivers mail like this in Rawlins. This town of 9,000 people operates in a predictable way. Everyone uses the postal service or leaves notes on the front door. This envelope is a disturbing anomaly. He goes back inside, closes the door carefully, and opens the envelope with hands that have begun to tremble involuntarily. Inside are 3 sheets of time-yellowed paper, covered in strange symbols, curved lines, and angular strokes that form complex and seemingly indecipherable patterns. Jack recognizes it immediately and his heart pounds. It's shorthand, but it's not just any common shorthand system. It's the personal method he created over 50 years ago, during the suffocating and terrifying days of the Vietnam War. An utterly unique code that only he knows. A code he never formally taught to anyone, that he never officially recorded in any military manual. His legs go weak, and he sits down heavily at the kitchen table, staring at the papers as if they were ghosts materialized from the past. How is this possible? Who in the world could have access to this secret and deeply personal code? The memories begin to flood his mind like violent waves crashing against rocks. Saigon, 1972. Jack was only 24, working as a signals intercept operator in a highly classified military intelligence unit. His critical job was to intercept enemy communications transmitted on specific frequencies, translate them quickly under extreme pressure, and pass on information that could mean life or death for soldiers in the field. The radio transmissions came in short, urgent bursts, and there simply wasn't enough time for conventional note-taking methods. It was in that environment of constant pressure that Jack developed his own unique shorthand system, a creative fusion of symbols based on patterns he had completely memorized through obsessive repetition. It was incredibly fast, extremely efficient, and absolutely personal. No one else could read his notes without the key that existed only in his head. His exceptional skill saved countless American lives. He could process far more information in far less time than any other intelligence analyst in the entire unit. Commanders praised him constantly. Colleagues admired him. But that same special ability eventually led Jack to morally dark places from which he could never completely escape. In 1973, Jack was assigned to the so-called Operation Twilight, an extremely sensitive and unofficially authorized mission that crossed the international border into the territory of Laos. Officially, that military operation never existed in the records. There are no public documents. There is no governmental acknowledgement. But Jack was there physically, on the muddy ground and in the dense jungles. He documented absolutely everything using his personal system. The enemy communication intercepts clearly showed Viet Cong troop movements, but they also unequivocally revealed the presence of innocent civilian villages in specific areas that were slated to be heavily bombed within the next 48 hours. Jack reported this critical information immediately through the proper chain of command. His superiors said the information would be carefully considered by the mission planners. It wasn't. The bombing happened exactly as originally planned. Dozens of innocent civilians died in the explosions. Women, children, the elderly, people who had absolutely nothing to do with the war. Jack spent the following weeks in a state of moral shock, transcribing cold clinical official reports, creating detailed documents that were later immediately classified as top secret, and, as his superiors firmly told him, completely destroyed to protect national security. He never spoke about it to anyone, not to his wife Margaret during all their years of marriage, not to his daughter Sarah as she was growing up. He carried that crushing weight completely alone for 50 whole years, through decades of silence and corrosive guilt. Now, sitting in his small, quiet kitchen in Rawlins, Wyoming, He looks at the familiar symbols on the yellowed sheets of paper and feels viscerally that the past he tried to bury has finally caught up with him. Jack spends the next 3 days completely locked inside his house, ignoring phone calls, meticulously deciphering the coded message. It is slow and painful mental work. His memory is rusty after so many years of not using the system, but the symbols gradually begin to make sense again, like a forgotten mother tongue that returns when you truly need it. It's like riding a bicycle. The body remembers even when the mind consciously resists. The full message is deliberately fragmented. Several critical parts are missing or have been purposely obscured to create mystery, but there are absolutely clear phrases that pierce his soul. They know. 1973. Laos, the file was not destroyed. Jack feels the blood literally run cold in his veins. Someone has the original documents that were supposed to have been destroyed decades ago. Someone knows exactly what happened in that terrible operation, and someone is deliberately using his own personal and secret code to contact him across time. But who exactly? And for what reason now? The following Thursday, Jack is working at the municipal library where he has volunteered twice a week for 5 years. Rawlins is a genuinely small town in deep Wyoming, and absolutely everyone knows everyone else across multiple generations. The library is a solid red brick building in the historic center of town, with tall wooden shelves that creak nostalgically and the comfortable smell of old books and aged paper. Jack genuinely enjoys the respectful silence of this place. He likes carefully organizing the shelves by the decimal system, helping high school students with school research, recommending books to the few dedicated readers who still show up regularly in the digital age. It's an intentionally simple and predictable life, or at least it was until recently. That Thursday afternoon, as he methodically catalogs recent donations of used books, an unknown man calmly enters the library. Tall, thin, with completely gray hair, his face deeply marked by time and experience. Jack doesn't recognize him immediately from the front, but there is something disturbingly familiar in the man's dark, penetrating eyes. Then the man speaks a single word: Jack. It's the voice that triggers the recognition, that slight but unmistakable Vietnamese accent. Jack stands up so abruptly that he knocks over an entire pile of books, which fall loudly to the silent floor. David? David Nguyen smiles sadly, his entire face transforming with the smile. It's really him after all these decades. David was the civilian Vietnamese interpreter who worked closely alongside Jack during the worst months of the war. They spent endless months together in remote and dangerous bases, translating urgent intercepts, sharing simple meals of military rations, talking at length about their distant families and hopes for survival. When Saigon finally fell catastrophically in 1975, Jack completely lost contact with David in the chaotic confusion of the evacuation. He realistically assumed that David had either died in the subsequent violence or been permanently trapped in communist Vietnam. But David survived against all odds. He managed to escape the country dangerously in 1979 on an overcrowded refugee boat, spent 3 difficult years in an overcrowded refugee camp in Thailand, and was finally officially resettled in the United States in the early 80s through a humanitarian program. Now he lives settled in San Francisco, works as a successful freelance translator and Vietnamese teacher, and has 3 adult American-born children. The 2 elderly men hug each other tightly, and Jack feels hot tears burn his eyes for the first time in years. They walk together to the small family diner on Main Street, order strong black coffee and homemade apple pie, and David carefully explains why he is there in Rawlins after so many years without contact. He has also received mysterious messages, identical envelopes with no identifiable sender, partially coded documents. David naturally doesn't know Jack's highly personal shorthand system, but the messages he received contained crystal-clear references to Operation Twilight and the full names of specific people who worked directly on that secret mission. David, ever meticulous, did extensive research online. He discovered a disturbing pattern. 3 former members of their old military unit have died in the last 2 years under circumstances officially classified as accidental. One died in an unexplained car crash on a rural Montana road. Another from a sudden and fatal heart attack in Oregon. The third fell to his death from a steep ladder in his own home in Texas. Mere statistical coincidences? David absolutely does not believe it. He is convinced that someone is systematically eliminating living witnesses of Operation Twilight, or perhaps seeking calculated revenge for what happened tragically in Laos 5 decades ago. Jack feels a cold chill run down his spine as he processes this information. He always knew intuitively that this terrible secret could eventually come back to haunt him like a persistent ghost, but he never imagined it would be like this. Not after so much time had passed, not when he was already too old to run. The two veterans firmly decide they must urgently find out who is sending these cryptic messages before it's definitively too late for all of them. The next day, Jack nervously calls his daughter Sarah from his landline phone. She lives alone in Denver since her divorce, works as a project manager at a growing tech company, and has an 8-year-old son from her broken marriage. Jack and Sarah are unfortunately not emotionally close in any way. Since Margaret died of cancer 5 years ago, the already distant relationship between father and daughter has become even colder and more formal. Sarah has always felt deeply that her father was emotionally closed off, psychologically distant, completely incapable of expressing genuine feelings. She knows absolutely nothing about his detailed military past beyond the most basic and superficial information. Jack says hesitantly that he needs to tell her something very important in person. Sarah immediately notices the unusual tone of urgency and vulnerability in her father's normally controlled voice, and sincerely promises to visit him the coming weekend. Meanwhile, Jack and David travel together to Cheyenne to try to access partially declassified military files. It's a long 2-hour drive on perfectly straight roads that monotonously cut through the empty, endless Wyoming prairie. They talk deeply about the distant war, about what happened afterward in the following years, about the completely different lives they built on separate continents. David details how extremely difficult it was to start completely from scratch in America, to laboriously learn a complex new language as an adult, to painfully adapt to a completely different culture where he was a permanent foreigner. Jack talks at length about his late wife, Margaret, how she was infinitely patient with his violent nightmares and prolonged daytime silences, how she wisely never pushed insistently to know the details of what really happened in Vietnam. In Cheyenne, they managed to get bureaucratic access to public veteran records and official documents partially declassified by age. It is a tedious and extremely slow administrative process involving multiple forms, but eventually, they find cold, documentary confirmation, 3 recent deaths, all exclusively of former members of the specific unit that participated directly in Operation Twilight. The officially recorded circumstances seem superficially harmless and accidental, but the specific details, when examined carefully, raise legitimate suspicions. The man who died in Montana was driving alone on a back road he knew absolutely by heart when his car mysteriously ran off the road with no apparent reason or skid marks. The one who had a fatal heart attack in Oregon had absolutely no documented medical history of chronic heart problems. The one who fell to his death from the ladder in Texas had been a highly trained Special Forces Ranger, conditioned to competently handle situations physically much more dangerous than household ladders. A statistical pattern is clearly forming when you connect the dots. When Jack finally returns to his home in Rawlins late in the afternoon, Sarah is already waiting there. She arrived earlier than planned, genuinely worried about her father after the unusual call. They sit uncomfortably in the small living room surrounded by family photos, and for the first time in entire decades, Jack tells the complete truth. He talks in detail about the real Vietnam, about the specific Operation Twilight, about the innocent civilians who died horribly because the critical information he provided was consciously ignored by superiors. He speaks openly about the crushing guilt he carries daily, about the recurring nightmares that still wake him up sweating in the middle of the night regularly. Sarah listens in absolute silence, carefully processing every painful word. She always knew instinctively that there was something deep her father deliberately wasn't telling her, but she never remotely imagined the moral magnitude. She simultaneously feels anger at the lie of omission, sadness for his pain, and confusion about how to process it all. But she also sees for the first time the genuine human vulnerability in her father, the invisible weight he has carried completely alone for so long. Sarah asks directly what exactly he intends to do now with this situation. Jack honestly isn't completely sure, but he knows deeply that he can no longer keep running indefinitely. 2 days later, Jack receives an unexpected phone call. It's an unknown female voice, calm but absolutely firm and determined. She introduces herself formally as Mai Tran. She explains that she is the adult daughter of one of the innocent civilians killed during the devastating bombing in Laos in 1973. Her entire family was completely destroyed that terrible day of fire and metal. She was only 2 years old and survived purely by a fortunate accident. She was temporarily with her maternal grandmother in another distant village visiting relatives. Mai grew up traumatized in post-war Vietnam, studied journalism in the United States on an academic scholarship, and became an investigative journalist specializing in war crimes. She has spent the last 10 years obsessively researching Operation Twilight through every possible channel. She gained access to leaked classified documents through confidential sources, meticulously studied military shorthand systems through old technical manuals, and patiently compared thousands of symbols until she finally deciphered Jack's unique system. She personally sent all the coded messages. Mai fundamentally wants public justice, but not violent personal revenge. She wants the historical truth to finally be told publicly and recorded. She wants the living responsible parties to take moral responsibility for what happened. Mai knows in detail about the recent suspicious deaths of the former unit members. She emphatically assures him she has absolutely nothing to do with those deaths. But she strongly suspects that government intelligence agencies are secretly involved, trying to permanently silence potentially dangerous witnesses before the explosive story inevitably comes to light publicly. Jack takes a deep breath and agrees to meet with her in person. They carefully arrange to meet at a neutral public cafe in Denver. Sarah firmly insists on going along to protect her father. David also travels specially from San Francisco. At the tense meeting, Mai methodically presents impressive evidence: official documents, disturbing photographs, recorded testimonies from elderly survivors. She has assembled an absolutely solid and meticulous journalistic case. But she critically needs someone from inside the operation, someone who was physically there on the ground to validate and authenticate everything conclusively. Jack looks for a long time at that carefully organized evidence and sees real human faces, people with names and stories, families completely destroyed by decisions he documented. He has carried this specific guilt completely alone for decades, but he has never done anything concrete to correct or expose it. Mai asks directly if he is genuinely willing to testify publicly about everything. Jack knows exactly what that decision concretely means. It will permanently destroy his reputation as a veteran. He could face unforeseen legal consequences. It will certainly attract unwanted and possibly dangerous public attention, but he looks at Sarah, sees genuine hope shining in her eyes for the first time. He looks at David, who nods encouragingly in silent support. He looks at Mai, clearly sees the deep pain she carries, so disturbingly similar to his own. And for the first time in 50 whole years, Jack makes a moral decision that is not fundamentally based on paralyzing fear or selfish self-preservation. He says yes, clearly. In the tense weeks that follow, the pressure increases dramatically from multiple directions. Jack receives intimidating visits from silent men in dark suits who vaguely identify themselves as national security consultants. They strongly suggest it would be significantly better for absolutely everyone involved if he simply forgot the dead past. They offer generous financial compensation. They casually mention that health is extremely fragile at this advanced age, that fatal accidents happen unexpectedly. David receives anonymous threatening calls in the middle of the night from blocked numbers. Sarah quickly hires an experienced lawyer who specializes specifically in controversial military cases and veterans' rights. Mai works intensely with courageous, independent journalists, legally ensuring that the full story will definitely be published widely, even if something tragic happens to the main witnesses. The tension grows exponentially. Jack can barely sleep 3 hours a night, but for the first time in decades, his nightmares have fundamentally changed. He still dreams regularly of the violent Vietnam, but now there is a visible path forward, a tangible possibility of redemption. Finally, the official hearing is formally scheduled. It is not a formal criminal trial, but a closed investigative session with government representatives, carefully selected accredited journalists, and lawyers representing multiple parties. Jack arrives very early, wearing the only suit he owns, kept in his closet. Sarah is firmly by his side, holding his hand. David has also come specially. Mai is sitting in the front row, watching intently. When Jack is officially called to testify under oath, he physically feels the weight of all the years on his stooped shoulders, but he begins to speak with a surprisingly firm voice, and once he finally starts, he cannot stop the flow of truth. He tells absolutely everything, omitting nothing. The full details of Operation Twilight, the specific intercepts that unequivocally revealed the presence of civilians, the urgent reports he made following protocol, the direct orders he received to immediately classify and completely forget. He physically presents copies of his original yellowed shorthand records, which he had secretly kept all these years in a box in the attic. psychologically unable to destroy them completely despite the orders. They are irrefutable physical evidence, contemporaneous documentation. The room falls into a heavy, absolute silence. Some of those present look uncomfortably at the floor. Others take notes frantically. Mai has silent tears rolling down her face. When Jack finally finishes speaking, there is a long, reverent silence. Then the questions begin from multiple directions. He answers them all with absolutely brutal and direct honesty. He doesn't defend or justify himself. He doesn't try to minimize responsibility. He just tells the naked truth. The story is published simultaneously 2 weeks later. Several respected journalistic outlets cover it extensively. The public impact is significant and immediate. There are heated national debates about individual military responsibility, manifestly illegal orders, and the real human cost of war. Veterans are deeply divided in their reactions. Some publicly call Jack a traitor who has tarnished all veterans. Others see him as someone finally fulfilling his true moral duty. Jack does not find complete absolution. He never realistically expected to. But he finds something personally more important and valuable. He finds a measure of inner peace. Sarah spends significantly more time with him now. They have genuinely real and deep conversations for the first time. Jack's grandson, who before barely knew his distant grandfather, begins to visit him regularly on weekends. David returns to San Francisco, but they maintain a religious weekly phone contact. They talk about comforting trivialities, about food recipes, about the weather. It is surprisingly comforting. Mai writes a detailed journalistic book about Operation Twilight. She dedicates an entire chapter specifically to Jack's testimony. She carefully describes him not as a sainted hero or a demonized villain, but as an imperfect man who finally had the courage to directly face his own inner shadows. On a quiet spring afternoon, Jack is sitting comfortably in the small garden behind his house. The perennial flowers that Margaret lovingly planted years ago are blooming vibrantly again. Sarah is beside him in another chair, and he is patiently teaching her his personal shorthand system, not to hide secrets, but as a living form of shared memory, a consciously transformed legacy. Sarah carefully copies the symbols into a new notebook. Jack gently corrects the strokes with infinite patience. It is a seemingly simple act, but it carries deep meaning for both of them. The code that once served war and secrecy now becomes a symbol of truth and genuine human connection. Jack looks at the immense open sky of Wyoming, that infinite blue that has always calmed him since childhood. He still carries deep scars. He still has difficult days with memories, but he is no longer completely alone with his personal ghosts. And that, he finally realizes with clarity, is more than he ever honestly imagined he deserved. The code has finally been deciphered. Not just the abstract symbols on paper, but the secrets he kept locked inside himself for so long. And with that deciphering came something completely unexpected. Not complete forgiveness, but the genuine possibility of redemption. Not forgetting, but conscious transformation. Jack Mercer will never be remembered by history as a perfect hero, but perhaps he will be remembered as a man who finally found the courage to tell the complete truth. And sometimes that is absolutely enough for a lifetime.